Okay, let's talk about something that probably drives a lot of you mad. Your energy bill. Specifically, that fixed bit, the standing charge, the daily fee you pay, regardless of whether you've used any energy at all. It just feels, well, unfair, especially if you're really trying to cut back. For loads of people, it feels like you're being penalized for being efficient. And now the regulator, Ofgem, is stepping in. They're proposing something quite big, making energy suppliers offer tariffs with a lower or even a zero standing charge LZSC tariffs, they call them.
Yeah, and it's really important we understand what's going on here, because that standing charge, while annoying, it does cover real fixed costs, things like maintaining the grid, the meters, customer service, stuff that has to be paid for. Ofgem can't just make those costs disappear. All they can do is shift where they get recovered from. So the fundamental trade-off we're looking at today, and this is key, is that if you lower the standing charge, the cost per unit of energy, the kilowatt-hour price, has to go up.
Right, so it's this tension between what feels fair to us as consumers and the sort of hard financial realities for the energy companies trying to balance their books.
Exactly. And Ofgem's confirmed they're consulting on this, aiming to get these new tariffs out there by January 2026.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive. Untangle these really quite polarized views. We've got consumer groups championing this, and energy firms warning it could be, well, a bit of a disaster if not done carefully. Let's get into it.
Let's start with why this is even happening, the consumer feeling. Ofgem's own research is pretty stark on this. Most people just think standing charges are unfair. They want them lower.
And here's a bit I found really fascinating from the research. Ofgem found that even high-energy users, people who would likely end up paying more overall if the unit rates went up, even they often said they'd prefer a lower standing charge.
It's quite revealing about psychology, isn't it? It suggests people value that feeling of control or maybe transparency more than just the bottom line sometimes. That fixed daily charge feels like a tax you can't avoid just for being connected. Whereas the unit rate, well, that feels like something you can actually influence by using less energy.
So it's a psychological hurdle as much as a financial one.
Definitely. And that's the tightrope Ofgem has to walk. Address that feeling, that perception of unfairness, without accidentally making people worse off financially.
But okay, let's flip to the supplier side. Moving those fixed costs, it's not trivial. What are the numbers involved?
Well, when this idea first came up, specifically a zero standing charge option within the price cap, EDF did some modeling. They estimated it could leave suppliers short by somewhere between $1.2 billion and $1.6 billion a year.
Wow, $1.6 billion. That's a huge potential hole in their finances.
It is. And that figure, or figures like it, are right at the heart of this debate. If suppliers genuinely face that kind of under-recovery risk, the market could become really unstable. That's why they're pushing back hard on how these tariffs might be designed.
Okay, hang on though. Is that 1.6 billion figure maybe a bit inflated? I mean, suppliers in a consultation, they have an interest in highlighting the worst case scenario, don't they? Does Ofgem's own analysis back up that level of risk?
That's a fair question. Industry models often do lean towards the higher end of risk, absolutely. But the regulator does acknowledge the risk is significant. They are worried about market stability. Think about it. If a ZSE tariff becomes mandatory, but it's basically a guaranteed money loser for suppliers, you could see companies pulling out of the market or jacking up prices on their standard tariffs to cover the losses. That's not good for anyone.
So they need to avoid forcing companies into offering something that just doesn't stack up financially.
Precisely. The goal isn't to create a loss leader everyone has to offer.
Okay, given that financial backdrop, where does the current system with the standing charge cause the most harm? The sources seem to point quite clearly towards vulnerable customers, especially those on prepayment meters, PPMs.
Yes, groups like BHESCO, the In-Fuel Poverty Coalition, they really highlight PPM users. And the way it harms them is quite specific and frankly pretty harsh. If someone on a prepayment meter runs out of money and can't top up, they self-disconnect, essentially. Or maybe they're away for a bit, perhaps in hospital.
Or just can't afford a top-up right then.
Exactly. During that time, even though they're using zero energy, the standing charge keeps ticking up day after day as debt on the meter.
Like a meter running backwards almost, building up what you owe before you can even use anything.
That's a good way to put it. And it creates this awful barrier. When they finally get some money or come back home, they have to pay off all that accumulated standing charge debt first before they can get any power or heating back on.
That feels fundamentally wrong. A zero or lower standing charge would get rid of that specific problem, wouldn't it?
Immediately, it removes that barrier to getting reconnected.
So facing that kind of issue, some groups are suggesting pretty radical solutions. BHESCO, you mentioned, they back an idea from the New Economics Foundation, a rising block tariff. What's that about?
Okay, so this is a really different way of thinking about energy pricing. It's essentially built on the idea of energy as a basic right up to a certain level. The model proposes everyone gets a basic amount of energy completely free. The modeling suggested something like 8,000 kilowatt hours of gas and 2,000 of electricity a year, enough for essentials.
Free energy. How on earth does that get paid for?
Right, that's the rising block bit. After that free basic allowance, you start paying. There'd be a standard rate for typical usage. But then, for very high usage in large houses, maybe swimming pools, stuff like that, there'd be a premium, much higher rate. The idea is that the big energy users effectively subsidize the free basic allowance for everyone else.
So it's a redistribution mechanism, basically, using energy pricing for social policy.
Exactly. It's very much focused on tackling fuel poverty and inequality directly through the tariff structure. Quite different from just tweaking the standing charge.
Okay, interesting concept. But let's bring it back to the LZSC tariffs. Ofgem is actually proposing and how suppliers see it. Utilita is an interesting case here, right? They've actually had a zero standing charge tariff for PPM customers for years.
They have since 2007. And their argument is quite specific. They say they had managed the costs that they reckon it cost them about $34 million since 2022, just in under recovery because it was their unique selling point. It attracted a certain type of customer, maybe helped keep customers loyal.
Ah, so it was a commercial choice, a differentiator. But if Ofgem makes everyone offer one,
Then Utilita loses that advantage completely. And this feeds directly into the supplier's biggest nightmare scenario, what they call self-selection.
right, so Energy raised this explicitly. The worry is that if you offer a ZSC tariff, the only people who'll choose it are the ones who know they'll save money. So the lowest users, maybe people with second homes they only visit occasionally, or just very frugal households.
Precisely. And if only those super low users are on the ZSC tariff, the supplier can't recover the fixed costs from them through the unit rate because they're barely using any units. The math just doesn't work.
Leading to huge losses for the supplier on that specific tariff.
Yes. And their only option then is to massively hike the unit rate on that ZSC tariff to try and compensate, which of course makes it a terrible deal for anyone who isn't an extremely low user.
So it stops being a real choice and becomes almost a trap.
Potentially, yes. A tariff that looks appealing but ends up costing most people more.
But is that self-selection outcome guaranteed? Or is it, again, maybe a bit of supplier lobbying? Can clever tariff design help?
It absolutely can. And this is where it gets interesting. ScottishPower, for example, they did some modeling too. They found that simple Z2C tariffs with just one single unit rate are probably the least viable for exactly that self-selection reason. But they suggested that falling block tariffs could actually work much better for a ZSC option.
Falling block, how does that work? Isn't it usually rising blocks where you pay more the more you use?
Usually, yes. A falling block flips it. You pay a relatively high unit rate for the first chunk of energy you use, say, the first few hundred kilowatt hours each month or quarter. But after that initial expensive block, the unit rate drops significantly, getting much cheaper.
Okay. How does that help with the ZSC problem?
Because the supplier effectively recovers the equivalent of the standing charge costs within that first guaranteed expensive block. Almost everyone will use some energy hitting that first block. So the supplier gets a predictable recovery of their fixed costs up front.
Ah, I see. And because the rate gets cheaper after that, it might still appeal to moderate users, not just the absolute minimal users.
Exactly. It potentially broadens the appeal beyond just those who would save money on any ZSE structure. It helps manage the self-selection risk and caps the supplier's potential losses, making the whole thing more financially viable.
That makes sense. So the how is crucial, not just the if. Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty of making this work. Two big sticking points seem to be, who gets these tariffs and how do you stop them being misused?
Right. First, eligibility and thresholds. The industry people like EDF, ScottishPower, argue strongly that you need a minimum consumption threshold, an MCT.
Meaning you have to use a certain amount of energy before you can even qualify for the ZSC tariff.
Yes. They see it as essential to protect themselves from the biggest risks like completely empty properties or second homes that are barely used, racking up zero standing charges indefinitely. Without an MCT, they argue, they'd have to load huge risk premiums onto the unit rate for everyone else.
Okay, that sounds logical on the surface. Stop empty buildings getting a free ride. But the consumer and fuel poverty groups hate this idea.
They really do. And Fuel Poverty Coalition, Fuel Poverty Action. They argue an MCT would be incredibly unfair. It would lock out precisely the people who might need help the most, those genuinely using very little energy because they're struggling financially, or perhaps elderly people being extremely careful, or someone off work due to long-term illness.
Their low usage should be a sign they need support, not a reason to be excluded from a potentially helpful tariff.
That's the argument. They say there must be better ways to weed out the empty properties or second homes, maybe using council tax data or records of void periods rather than a blunt instrument like an MCT that penalizes vulnerable low users.
It's a tough one. Then there's the whole technology question. Smart meters. Utilita insists they should be mandatory for any ZSC tariff. Why?
Well, partly it goes back to those tariff structures we just discussed, like falling blocks. Many older traditional meters simply can't be programmed to handle that kind of complexity. They're built for simpler, flat-rate tariffs. Plus, smart meters provide much more granular, typically daily, usage data. Suppliers argue they need that data to accurately track costs and reconcile everything, especially with these more complex CSC structures.
But mandating smart meters instantly creates another exclusion problem, doesn't it?
It's a big one. The advocacy groups jump right on this. They point out there are still many people, often vulnerable households, living in places where smart meters just can't be installed yet, maybe blocks of flats with signal issues or very rural areas.
So making smart meters a requirement would lock those people out purely due to their housing situation or location. It risks deepening that digital divide.
It does. It's that classic clash. The technology needed for the system to work smoothly versus ensuring fair access for everyone, especially the most vulnerable.
Okay, let's talk practicalities. Timing and rules. Ofgem's aiming for January 2026 using standard license conditions, or SLCs.
And SLCs are serious. They're legally binding rules for suppliers. This wouldn't be optional. They'd have to offer an LZSC tariff. Although, it's worth noting, some consumer groups have actually suggested maybe pushing the start date back slightly to April 2026.
Why is that?
Just to avoid introducing major complex changes to billing systems and tariffs right in the middle of winter, when energy use is highest and call centers are busiest, give it a bit more breathing room, make sure it's rolled out smoothly.
Makes sense. And who has to offer it? Was there talk of only making big suppliers do it?
That was considered initially maybe setting a threshold like only suppliers with over 150,000 customers. But pretty much everyone, from the big suppliers like EDF to the consumer groups, argued against that. They wanted to apply universally to all domestic suppliers.
Why's that? Fairness.
Partly fairness, but also to avoid distorting the market. If smaller suppliers were exempt, they could potentially undercut the bigger ones, who are forced to carry the financial risk of the ZSC tariffs. A level playing field is seen as crucial.
And crucially, how will Ofgem make sure suppliers don't just offer a useless ZSC tariff? Compliance is everything.
Absolutely. Ofgem says suppliers will be monitored against specific outcomes. And a key one is ensuring the tariffs are, quote, not priced excessively, which is, well, it's crucial but also quite vague. It means suppliers have to be able to recover their legitimate costs and make a reasonable profit margin. But they can't just set the unit rate so astronomically high that the ZSC tariff is effectively pointless for almost everyone.
So Ofgem will have to make a judgment call on whether the pricing is fair and the tariff is actually viable for consumers.
Yes, that phrase, not priced excessively, gives Ofgem the power to intervene if they think suppliers are trying to game the system by making the ZSC option deliberately unattractive.
Okay, zooming out a bit, this whole LZSC thing, it's part of something bigger, isn't it?
It is. It fits into Ofgem's wider review of how costs are allocated and recovered across the whole energy system. The DIR review, they call it. They're looking at the whole picture, trying to figure out how to pay for the grid, support vulnerable people, and manage the shift to renewables, all while keeping things fair and efficient.
So it's one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Definitely. And alongside this, Ofgem is also developing a separate debt relief support scheme. They know that changing tariff structures won't magically solve the massive problem of energy debt that's built up, particularly for PPM users. That needs its own solution, too.
So to sum up, these LZSC tariffs are meant to give people more choice, more control, maybe a greater sense of fairness. But getting there involves navigating some really tricky territory around supplier risk, technology, and who might get left behind.
And that brings us to a really interesting final thought, I think, which connects to the wider regulatory landscape. You've got the Financial Conduct Authority's consumer duty principles now, which demand financial products offer fair value.
Right, so how does that apply here?
Well, here's the potential paradox. You design a tariff, the ZSE tariff, primarily to give customers that feeling of control, that psychological win we talked about. People might like the sound of it, feel it's fair, and switch. But what if, because of the necessarily higher unit rate, that customer ends up paying significantly more overall than they would have on a standard tariff with a standing charge?
Does that constitute fair value, even if the customer chose it willingly?
That's the million-dollar or maybe billion-pound question for the regulator. Is a tariff that feels fairer but costs more actually a good outcome? Does it represent a poor choice that regulation should ideally prevent, even if it's offered?
Hmm. Balancing the perception of fairness against the cold, hard reality of the final bill, that really does capture the challenge Ofgem faces in getting this right by 2026. Definitely something to keep an eye on.